Have you ever found yourself thinking, if I could just be a little more patient, a little more understanding, a little more loving, maybe they would finally change? If that thought has ever crossed your mind, you're far from alone. In fact, it's one of the most common beliefs people carry into relationships with narcissistic individuals. It's also one of the most painful because it convinces good people that the solution to someone else's destructive behavior is simply becoming an even better version of themselves. So they become more forgiving, more accommodating, more available. They apologize for things that weren't their fault. They overlook disrespect because they believe everyone deserves another chance. They silence their own needs because they don't want to create conflict. And with every sacrifice, they quietly tell themselves the same story. One day they'll realize how much I love them. But what if that's the very belief keeping you trapped? What if your kindness isn't the cure? What if it's the very thing that's being exploited? That's exactly what we're going to explore today, because understanding this single psychological truth can completely change the way you see narcissistic relationships, and perhaps more importantly, the way you see yourself. The first thing we need to understand is that kindness and change are not the same thing. Most of us grow up believing that love has the power to transform people. We hear stories about patience healing broken relationships. We admire people who stand by their partners through difficult times. We celebrate forgiveness because in healthy relationships, forgiveness often creates room for growth. But here's the part nobody talks about. Those principles only work when both people are committed to growth. A healthy relationship is built on mutual responsibility. If one person hurts the other, they acknowledge it. If trust is damaged, both people work together to rebuild it. If mistakes happen, accountability follows. That's what emotional maturity looks like. A narcissistic relationship often follows an entirely different pattern. Instead of asking, "How did my behavior affect you?" the focus becomes, "How do I stop you from questioning me?" Instead of accepting responsibility, blame is redirected. Instead of listening, they defend. Instead of reflecting, they justify. And instead of changing, they often expect you to adjust. At first, these differences are incredibly difficult to recognize because narcissistic behavior rarely begins with cruelty. In fact, it often begins with exactly the opposite. Many people describe the early stages as feeling almost magical. The connection seems effortless. Conversations last for hours. You feel understood, appreciated, chosen. They seem deeply interested in your dreams, your fears, your childhood, your ambitions. For the first time in a long time, you feel completely seen. Psychologists sometimes refer to this stage as idealization. Everything feels intense. Everything moves quickly. You begin imagining a future together long before you've truly had time to understand who this person really is. And that's important because emotional attachment forms much faster than emotional understanding. By the time inconsistencies begin appearing, your heart is already invested. Maybe the criticism starts subtly. They joke about something you're insecure about. Then they tell you you're too sensitive when you're hurt. Perhaps they become irritated when you spend time with friends. Maybe they expect immediate replies to messages but disappear for hours themselves. At first, none of these moments seem significant. Everyone has flaws. Everyone has bad days. Healthy people understand that. So instead of questioning the relationship, you begin searching for explanations. They've had a stressful week. They're dealing with childhood trauma. They're afraid of being abandoned. They didn't really mean it. Notice what your mind is doing. Every uncomfortable experience is immediately followed by an explanation that protects your image of them. That's a very human response. Our brains naturally try to reduce emotional conflict. When reality clashes with what we want to believe, we often adjust our interpretation before we adjust our expectations. That's why intelligent, compassionate people can remain in unhealthy relationships for years. It isn't because they're weak, it's because hope is incredibly persuasive. Hope whispers, "This isn't who they really are." Hope says, Once life settles down, things will be different. Hope reminds you of the amazing person you met in the beginning. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop judging the relationship by what's happening today. You start judging it by what it could become. That's where the cycle quietly begins. One of the biggest misconceptions about narcissism is that narcissists don't experience emotions. That's simply not true. Many narcissistic individuals genuinely experience sadness, insecurity, fear, loneliness, and shame. The problem isn't that they never feel. The problem is how those feelings are managed. Instead of processing uncomfortable emotions internally, responsibility is often projected outward. If they feel criticized, someone else becomes the problem. If they fail, circumstances are blamed. If they're ashamed, they may attack the person who triggered that feeling instead of examining it. This is one reason arguments become so confusing. You're trying to solve the issue. They're trying to protect their self-image. Those are completely different goals. Imagine two people trying to drive the same car in opposite directions. No matter how hard both people try, they aren't traveling toward the same destination. That's exactly what happens in many narcissistic relationships. One person is trying to create understanding, the other is trying to avoid accountability. And because those goals conflict, every conversation becomes exhausting. You've probably experienced it yourself. You begin a discussion about one specific behavior. Maybe they broke another promise. Maybe they embarrassed you in front of other people. Maybe they ignored your feelings during an argument. You calmly explain what happened, but somehow the conversation ends with you defending yourself. Suddenly you're apologizing, explaining, justifying, trying to prove you aren't the selfish one, trying to prove you aren't overreacting, trying to prove your feelings are valid. By the end of the discussion, you're emotionally drained, and the original issue was never resolved. If that sounds familiar, it's because you're no longer having a conversation about behavior. You're participating in a struggle over reality itself. And when reality constantly feels negotiable, something dangerous begins to happen. You slowly stop trusting yourself. Losing trust in yourself doesn't happen overnight. It happens so gradually that most people don't notice it until they look back and wonder, when did I become this uncertain about everything? At first, it's something small. You remember a conversation one way, but they insist it happened differently. You clearly remember a promise they made, yet they confidently deny ever saying it. You express that something hurt you, and instead of acknowledging your feelings, they tell you that you're imagining things. After hearing this often enough, your confidence begins to weaken. You stop saying, "I know what happened." Instead, you begin saying, "Maybe I'm remembering it wrong." That sentence is far more significant than it sounds. Because once you begin doubting your own perception, you naturally become more dependent on someone else's version of reality. This is one of the reasons emotionally manipulative relationships are so difficult to leave. People often imagine manipulation as loud, obvious, or dramatic. In reality, it's frequently subtle. It happens through repeated conversations that slowly reshape how you see yourself. Eventually, you no longer trust your own emotions without first checking whether the other person approves of them. You don't ask yourself, "How do I feel?" You ask yourself, "Will they think my feelings are reasonable?" Notice what has happened. Your internal compass has quietly been replaced by external validation. That's a dangerous place to live because your emotional stability now depends on someone whose perception constantly changes to protect themselves. One day your feelings matter. The next day, they're too emotional. One day you're the most caring person they've ever met. The next day you're selfish because you disagreed with them. This inconsistency creates confusion, and confusion keeps people emotionally attached far longer than clarity ever could. Why? Because confused people don't make confident decisions. They hesitate, they analyze, they second guess themselves, they keep searching for answers. That search often sounds like this. Maybe I explained myself badly. Maybe I chose the wrong moment. Maybe if I stay calmer next time, they'll understand. Each of these thoughts feels logical, but together they create a dangerous pattern. Every solution involves changing yourself. Very little attention is given to the other person's repeated behavior. Psychologists often notice something fascinating in these relationships. The more one person takes responsibility, the less responsibility the other person seems willing to accept. It's almost like a balance scale. As your accountability increases, theirs decreases. Before long, you're carrying emotional responsibilities that were never yours to begin with. You're responsible for keeping the peace. You're responsible for preventing arguments. You're responsible for making sure they don't feel criticized. You're responsible for repairing every disagreement. You're responsible for reassuring them after they hurt you. Read that last sentence again. You're comforting the person who caused the pain. That isn't emotional maturity. That's emotional imbalance. One of the clearest signs that kindness has become unhealthy is when it consistently flows in only one direction. Healthy kindness is mutual. Healthy compassion moves both ways. Healthy love allows both people to feel emotionally safe. But when kindness becomes a one-way street, it slowly transforms into self-sacrifice. And self-sacrifice is often praised by people who benefit from it. Think about how often you've heard phrases like, "If you really loved me," "You're supposed to stand by me," "Nobody's perfect," "Relationships take work." None of those statements are entirely wrong. Relationships do take work. People aren't perfect. But those ideas become dangerous when they're used to excuse behavior that never changes. There is a profound difference between making mistakes and creating patterns. Everyone loses their temper occasionally. Everyone says the wrong thing from time to time. Everyone has moments they regret. Healthy people take ownership of those moments. Patterns are different. Patterns repeat. Patterns become predictable. Patterns continue despite repeated conversations, repeated apologies, and repeated promises. That's why psychologists encourage people to pay attention to behavior over time rather than isolated incidents. Anyone can have a bad day. Anyone can have a wonderful day. Neither tells you very much on its own. Patterns tell the real story. Imagine meeting someone who apologizes every Friday, but repeats the exact same behavior every Monday. How meaningful does the apology become after 6 months? After 2 years? After 10? Eventually, you realize the apology wasn't changing the behavior. It was maintaining access to the relationship. That's a painful distinction, because many empathetic people hear apologies as signs of growth. Sometimes they're simply signs that the person doesn't want to experience consequences. One of the most difficult truths to accept is this: not everyone experiences your kindness the way you intend it. A healthy person usually experiences kindness as love, as support, as generosity. Someone with strong narcissistic traits may experience endless kindness very differently. They may experience it as permission, permission to continue, permission to push another boundary, permission to expect forgiveness again. Not because kindness causes abuse, but because kindness without boundaries removes accountability. Imagine lending someone 20 pounds. They promise to repay you. They never do. A week later, they ask to borrow another 20 pounds, then another and another. At some point, the issue isn't generosity, it's the absence of limits. Relationships work in much the same way. Unlimited emotional availability without accountability rarely creates respect. It often creates expectation, and expectations have a way of growing. What was once appreciated slowly becomes assumed. What was once extraordinary becomes ordinary. Soon, your sacrifices are no longer recognized. They're simply expected. That's one of the saddest moments in many narcissistic relationships. You give more than ever before, yet somehow you're still made to feel as though you're not doing enough. You become trapped in a race with no finish line. No matter how much love you offer, the goalposts continue to move. That's because the problem was never the amount of love you gave. The problem was believing that love alone could change someone who wasn't willing to confront themselves. And that's where everything begins to change. Because the moment you stop asking, how can I make them different? You begin asking a far more powerful question. Why have I spent so much of my life believing I had to earn the love and respect that should have been given freely? That question doesn't just change how you see the narcissist, it changes how you see yourself. And once that happens, there is no going back. There's a question I want you to carry with you before we move on. What if you've never actually been fighting for the relationship? What if you've been fighting for the version of the relationship you hoped would exist? Those aren't the same thing. Hope has a remarkable ability to keep us emotionally invested long after reality has begun telling a different story. It encourages us to focus on potential instead of patterns, promises instead of consistency, and isolated moments of affection instead of the relationship as a whole. That's why so many kind people stay longer than they ever imagined they would. They're not holding on to what the relationship is today. They're holding on to what they believe it could become tomorrow. But healthy relationships aren't built on potential. They're built on repeated actions. Real love doesn't ask you to constantly question your worth. Real respect doesn't disappear every time you disagree. And genuine emotional safety doesn't require you to sacrifice your identity just to keep the peace. Perhaps the hardest truth to accept is that kindness was never your problem. You weren't too patient. You weren't too forgiving. You weren't too loving. Your mistake wasn't having a good heart. Your mistake was believing that your good heart could do someone else's emotional work. No amount of empathy can replace another person's willingness to take responsibility. No amount of patience can create accountability where none exists. And no amount of love can heal someone who refuses to acknowledge the harm they continue to cause. That realization isn't meant to make you cynical. It's meant to set you free. Because the moment you stop asking, how can I change them? You create space for a much more important question. Why have I spent so much energy trying to earn the love and respect that should never have required earning in the first place? That question changes everything. It shifts your focus away from fixing another person and toward understanding yourself. It helps you recognize that the greatest danger in a narcissistic relationship isn't simply being manipulated, it's slowly losing sight of who you are while trying to keep someone else happy. And once you begin seeing that clearly, you also begin to understand something even more important. The goal isn't to become less kind. The goal is to stop giving your kindness without protecting it. Because kindness without boundaries doesn't heal unhealthy relationships. Too often, it only teaches unhealthy people that you'll continue accepting what should never have become normal. So if you've been waiting for the day when your love would finally be enough to change them, this may be the most important truth you'll hear today. You cannot love someone into becoming the person they have no desire to become. And while that truth can be painful, it's also incredibly liberating because it means their choices are not a reflection of your worth. Their inability to love you in a healthy way does not mean you were difficult to love. It simply means you were trying to build something meaningful with someone who wasn't willing to do their part. In the next part, we'll look at what actually protects you. We'll explore why boundaries often trigger narcissists, why guilt keeps so many people trapped, and the psychological shifts that allow you to reclaim your confidence without becoming cold, bitter, or losing the kindness that makes you who you are. So if there's one message I hope you take away from this conversation, it's this. Being kind was never your mistake. Your kindness wasn't the problem. Your patience wasn't the problem. Your willingness to love wasn't the problem. The problem was believing that your kindness could do the emotional work that only another person can choose to do themselves. You cannot love someone into respecting you. You cannot sacrifice enough to make someone value you. And you cannot heal a person who refuses to acknowledge the pain they continue to cause. The truth is, The greatest protection against a narcissist isn't finding the perfect words, winning the perfect argument, or proving your worth one more time. It's knowing your worth no longer needs their approval. It's trusting your own instincts again. It's setting boundaries without apologizing for them. And it's understanding that protecting your peace is not an act of selfishness, it's an act of self-respect. One day, you'll look back and realize that the energy you spent trying to fix someone else was the very energy you needed to rebuild yourself. You'll stop chasing explanations. You'll stop waiting for the apology that may never come. You'll stop hoping that one more act of kindness will finally change everything. And instead, you'll begin creating a life where respect isn't something you have to earn, it's something you're surrounded by. Because healthy relationships don't ask you to shrink. They don't make you question your reality. They don't require you to abandon yourself just to keep someone else happy. They allow you to be fully yourself, knowing that love and respect can exist side by side. So if you've been waiting for a sign to stop carrying the weight of someone else's choices, let this be that sign. Choose peace over chaos. Choose clarity over confusion. Choose self-respect over endless sacrifice. And above all, remember this. The strongest thing you'll ever do isn't changing a narcissist. It's refusing to lose yourself trying. If this video gave you a new perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever mistaken endless kindness for the solution? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more psychology-based insights, and share it with someone who may be struggling in silence. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, protect your peace, trust your intuition, and never forget this. Your kindness is a gift, but the first person who deserves that gift is you.